The funeral had been a slow, suffocating affair, filled with the kind of grief that felt more like a performance than something genuine, a room packed with people who had shown up more out of obligation than love, their hushed voices carrying the weight of rehearsed condolences and meaningless small talk. The air inside the church had been thick with the scent of flowers that had started to wilt, the perfume of too many elderly women blending together into something cloying. The occasional muffled sob breaking the uneasy quiet that settled over the pews like a heavy fog. My father had been the kind of man people respected from a distance, someone who commanded authority without raising his voice, the type who inspired admiration and fear in equal measure, and as I sat through the eulogies, I couldn't help but notice how carefully people chose their words, how no one dared to speak about him with anything less than absolute reverence. I had been bracing myself for the inevitable since the moment I arrived, knowing full well that grief had done nothing to soften my mother's edges, that she would seize this moment not as a time for reflection or mourning, but as an opportunity to reassert control, to remind me exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of our family. My brother Mark had barely acknowledged my presence when I walked into the service, offering me nothing more than a clipped nod before returning his attention to the group of relatives who had gathered around him like he was some kind of grieving prince, waiting to be comforted. He had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our mother's eyes, the one whose mistakes were forgiven before they were even acknowledged, while I had been cast as the outsider, the one who had dared to leave, to build a life outside the suffocating expectations of the family name. By the time we arrived at the wake, held in the house that was supposed to be my father's pride and joy, I could already see the wheels turning behind my mother's carefully composed expression, the way she kept glancing at me like she was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The house felt hollow without my father in it, the usual warmth replaced with an eerie stillness, the walls seeming to absorb the murmured conversations of the guests who lingered in the living room, sipping their drinks and speaking in hushed tones. I knew what was coming before she even opened her mouth, knew that she had been rehearsing the words long before we had even lowered my father into the ground, and yet, when she finally spoke, I still felt something inside me twist with bitter amusement at the sheer audacity of it all. "Well," my mother said, standing in the center of the room like a queen addressing her court, her voice smooth and unwavering as she looked directly at me, her lips curving into the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Now that everything is said and done, I suppose it's time to talk about what happens next." She glanced toward Mark, who was doing a pitiful job of pretending he wasn't enjoying this, his arms crossed over his chest, his mouth twitching at the corners as he awaited the moment of victory he thought was inevitable. "Your father and I discussed this a long time ago, and we both agreed that Mark should inherit the house. It only makes sense, of course. He's been here, taking care of things, while you were off doing whatever it is you do. You were never around anyway, so I don't imagine this comes as much of a surprise." I let this silence stretch between us, let the weight of her words settle over the room, watching as a few of our relatives shifted uncomfortably, some of them exchanging wary glances, others carefully looking anywhere but at me, unwilling to get involved. Mark's smirk deepened as he leaned against the arm of the couch, his confidence radiating off him in waves, already envisioning himself as the new man of the house, the rightful heir to everything he had been promised. I could feel their expectation thick in the air, the way they all waited for me to react, for me to protest, to argue, to lash out like they wanted me to. Instead, I simply tilted my head, let my lips curve into the faintest ghost of a smile, and whispered, "Check the will again." For the first time since the conversation started, the easy confidence on my mother's face faltered, the briefest flicker of uncertainty flashing behind her eyes before she scoffed, shaking her head like I was nothing more than a nuisance prolonging the inevitable. "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Emma," she said, waving a dismissive hand, already reaching for the folder that had been sitting on the table, the one that contained the final words of my father. The very thing she thought would confirm what she had believed to be true all along. "There's no need for dramatics, I already know what it says." But as she flipped open the will, as her eyes scanned the first line, her smirk vanished, the color draining from her face as the words on the page registered, as reality came crashing down in a way she had never expected. The silence in the room stretched unbearably, the tension thick enough to suffocate, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as her hands trembled against the paper, her fingers tightening around the edges, as if she could somehow will the words into changing. Mark shifted beside her, his brows knitting together in confusion, clearly thrown off by the sudden change in her demeanor. "What does it say?" he demanded, leaning closer, his voice no longer carrying the same smug certainty it had moments ago. My mother didn't answer immediately, her lips parting as if she was about to say something before snapping shut again, her throat working around a response she couldn't seem to form. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her expression I had never seen before: fear. I leaned forward slightly, my voice quiet, even unwavering. "Something wrong, Mother?" The will trembled in her hands, the paper crinkling under the force of her grip, and for the first time since this conversation began, I had the pleasure of watching her struggle for words, searching for some way to regain control, only to find there was none left to claim. I didn't need to read it to know what it said, didn't need to see the words to know that my father had made sure, even in death, that she wouldn't get away with what she had planned. And judging by the look on her face, she had just realized it too. My mother was still gripping the will as if she could physically alter its contents by sheer force of will alone, her knuckles turning white from how tightly she was holding the pages, her breath uneven as her mind scrambled to make sense of what she had just read. Mark was still hovering beside her, his patience wearing thinner with every second of silence that passed, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface as he waited for an explanation that wasn't coming fast enough for his liking. He had spent years being handed things without effort, had grown so accustomed to things always working in his favor that he had never considered a reality in which something he had been promised could be taken away before he even had the chance to enjoy it. "What the hell does it say?" Mark finally snapped, reaching for the paper in my mother's hands, his fingers curling around the edges as he yanked it toward himself, his eyes scanning the text so quickly I knew he wasn't fully processing the words, only searching for the part that mattered. His confidence, so sure and unwavering only minutes earlier, shattered in an instant as his expression twisted into something ugly, something almost unrecognizable, his shoulders stiffening as the truth settled deep into his bones. "This has to be a joke," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as he read the line again, as if the words would rearrange themselves if he only looked at them hard enough. "Dad wouldn't do this to me. He wouldn't do this to us." But he had, and they both knew it. My mother snapped out of her stunned silence, her panic giving way to outrage as she turned on me, her carefully crafted composure slipping as she realized, for the first time in her life, that she had completely lost control of the situation. "You did this," she accused, her voice sharp, her eyes burning with a fury I had never seen directed at me so openly before. "You manipulated him into changing it, didn't you? You took advantage of him when he was sick, filled his head with lies so you could swoop in and take everything from us." I laughed then, not out of amusement but out of sheer disbelief at how easily she could rewrite history in her own mind, how quickly she could convince herself that she was the victim in all of this, despite all the lies and manipulations that had led to this exact moment. "That's funny," I said, crossing my arms as I tilted my head, my gaze locked onto hers without a hint of hesitation. "Because the way I remember it, he was the one who came to me when he started suspecting that you and Mark were hiding things from him. He wasn't stupid, Mom. He saw through both of you a long time ago, but I guess he just kept hoping he was wrong." I let the words sink in, watching as my mother's expression flickered, as her mouth pressed into a thin line, as her mind raced to find a way out of this conversation before I could say anything else that might expose the truth to the rest of the room. Mark, however, wasn't as skilled at masking his emotions, his anger spilling out in waves as he took a step forward, his movements tense, his body practically vibrating with resentment. "This doesn't make any sense," he insisted, gripping the will in his hands so tightly the paper crinkled beneath his fingers. "Dad knew I needed that house. He knew I had plans for it, that I was counting on this." "You counted on something that was never yours to begin with," I said, my voice even, my expression unreadable as I stared at him, unflinching in the face of his anger. You assumed, just like Mom did, that you were entitled to it simply because you existed, because you were always the one they protected, the one who never had to take responsibility for anything. But Dad wasn't as blind as you thought he was, and when he realized just how much you had both taken from him, he decided to make sure you didn't get the chance to take anything else. The room had gone silent, the distant hum of voices from the rest of the wake fading into white noise as the weight of my words settled over them like a suffocating blanket. I could feel the eyes of the few relatives who had gathered around us, the ones who had been pretending not to listen but were now unable to look away, their expressions a mix of curiosity, shock, and something close to amusement. The family had always known about the favoritism, had always whispered about the way Mark had been handed opportunities that I had been denied, but they had never seen my mother truly lose before, had never seen the moment where she realized she had no moves left to make. I didn't need to do much after that. The damage was already done. The moment the truth was out, the carefully curated image my mother had spent years building started to crumble around her, the cracks in her story growing larger with every passing second. I didn't have to tell people outright what she had done, didn't have to spell out the financial mismanagement, the reckless spending, the debts she and Mark had accumulated in anticipation of an inheritance that was never coming. All I had to do was let them talk. It started small, just murmurs here and there, whispered conversations exchanged behind carefully placed hands, speculative glances shot in my mother's direction as people started piecing things together on their own. Then came the questions, quiet at first, then louder, bolder, more pointed. I thought they said Mark was getting the house, one relative asked, confusion etched across her face as she glanced between my mother and me, watching as Margaret's face remained carefully still. If Emma was the one in the will, then what did they mean when they said the house was already taken care of? That was when I saw the first flicker of real panic in my mother's eyes, the moment she realized that she had overplayed her hand, that she had spoken too soon, had revealed too much before securing what she thought was a guaranteed victory. She hadn't just assumed she was getting everything, she had already started spending money they didn't have. I leaned back against the table, my arms still crossed, my smirk barely concealed as I watched her squirm under the weight of her own miscalculation. "Something wrong, Mom?" I asked, my voice deliberately light, deliberately unconcerned. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Mark exhaled sharply, his hands running through his hair as he turned away from me, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear, his frustration boiling over in real time. My mother, on the other hand, said nothing, her lips pressed together so tightly they had gone pale, her gaze locked on some distant point on the floor as if looking at me directly might make her combust. I knew what was coming next, knew that the moment this wake ended, she and Mark would retreat behind closed doors, scrambling to fix what couldn't be fixed, desperate to find a way to regain control before everything slipped through their fingers completely. But it was already too late. I had spent my entire life watching them play this game, but what they had never realized, what they had never even considered, was that I had been learning from them the entire time. And now, it was my turn to make the next move. The day after the funeral, I arrived at the house earlier than anyone expected, my key slipping into the lock with ease, the familiar creak of the front door filling the silent hallway as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and faint traces of my father's aftershave, a sharp contrast to the tension that still clung to the walls after the previous night's disaster. I took my time moving through the house, letting my fingertips trail along the furniture, the picture frames, the old bookshelves that had been gathering dust for years, my steps slow and deliberate as I absorbed the reality of what had just unfolded. This house, the one my mother had so confidently handed to Mark in her mind, the one they had already been making plans for, was now legally and indisputably mine, and there was nothing they could do to change it. The first thing I did was call a locksmith, instructing him to replace every single lock on the doors, ensuring that the keys my mother and Mark had been using for years were now completely useless. It was a quiet but effective declaration, a message sent without words, a single action that made it unmistakably clear that their control over this place was gone. The locksmith didn't ask questions, only nodded as he got to work, and by the time the last bolt slid into place, I felt the first real wave of satisfaction settle deep in my chest, the weight of their expectations crumbling beneath the reality of my ownership. By midday, I had started going through the paperwork my father had left behind, sorting through old bank statements, insurance policies, and legal documents that had been sitting in his study, untouched since his health had started declining. I knew my mother and Mark would come back eventually, knew they wouldn't be able to stay away for long, but I had no intention of waiting for them to catch up. If they had spent years assuming I was too distant, too uninvolved, too uninterested in the details of this family's finances, then they were about to learn just how wrong they had been. It didn't take long for me to find what I was looking for, the proof of what I had suspected all along, buried beneath years of carefully hidden transactions, missing withdrawals, and inconsistencies that made my stomach turn the more I uncovered. My father, meticulous as he was, had left behind everything, every bank statement, every transfer. Every note in his scratchy handwriting that hinted at the suspicions he had started to develop before his health had deteriorated too much for him to do anything about it. Mark had been siphoning money from our father's accounts for years, little by little, amounts small enough to go unnoticed at first, but accumulating into something significant, something undeniable, something that had only grown bolder with time. My mother had known, of course, had either turned a blind eye or actively helped cover it up, had justified it in the same way she always did. Mark needed it more. Mark deserved it. Mark was the one who was supposed to inherit everything anyway. So what difference did it make? I sat back in my father's old chair, exhaling slowly as I let the weight of it all sink in, my fingers tapping lightly against the desk as I considered my next move. If they thought they could still manipulate me, if they thought they could guilt me into handing everything back, they were about to find out just how badly they had underestimated me. By the time they arrived at the house later that evening, their expressions tight with barely concealed frustration, I had already changed the locks, already cut off their access to every account they had been draining for years, already begun making arrangements to ensure that they would feel the full weight of their actions. My mother knocked once before trying the handle, her face twisting in irritation when she realized it wouldn't budge, her hand tightening into a fist as she knocked again, harder this time, her patience slipping away like sand through an open palm. I didn't rush to open the door, didn't give them the satisfaction of thinking I was waiting for them, didn't let them believe for even a second that they still had control over the situation. When I finally did unlock it, I leaned against the frame, arms crossed, expression unreadable, letting the silence stretch between us just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "You changed the locks," my mother said finally, her voice clipped, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness, any hint that I might be willing to compromise. "Of course I did," I said simply, tilting my head slightly, watching as her lips pressed into a thin line, as Mark shifted beside her, his frustration barely contained. "It's my house now. Wouldn't want anyone coming in uninvited." Mark let out a sharp breath, shaking his head, his hands settling on his hips as he took a step closer, his frustration bubbling over into something almost laughable. "You can't seriously be doing this," he said, his voice laced with disbelief, like the very idea of me standing my ground was so absurd that he couldn't even comprehend it. "You don't even want this place. You don't need it. You're just doing this to screw us over." I raised an eyebrow, letting his words hang in the air for a moment before replying, my tone smooth, measured, entirely unaffected. "Funny," I said, my gaze never leaving his. "That's exactly what Dad must have thought when he realized you were stealing from him." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of my words landing like a physical blow, Mark's face draining of color as his mouth opened and closed uselessly, his mind scrambling for a defense he didn't have. My mother's expression shifted from anger to something closer to panic, her fingers twitching at her sides, her carefully constructed control slipping as she realized that I knew, that I had seen the evidence, that there was no way out of this conversation that wouldn't end with them losing everything. "You don't understand," she started, her voice softer now, almost desperate, as if changing her tone could somehow erase the damage that had already been done. "We had to. Mark needed help, and your father was being unreasonable. He wasn't thinking clearly. I held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence, my patience wearing thinner with every word that left her mouth. Don't, I said, my voice firm, my expression unwavering. Don't insult me by trying to justify what you did. I don't care why you did it. I care that you thought you could get away with it. My mother swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists at her sides, her carefully constructed image cracking at the edges, desperation creeping into her features. Emma, she tried again, this time softer, this time almost pleading. You don't have to do this. We can fix this. Just think about what you're doing. I let a slow, deliberate smile creep onto my lips, tilting my head as I met her gaze with something cold, something unshakable, something that told her, without question, that the time for thinking was long past. Oh, I already have, I said. And the next move was already mine. Mark stormed into the house like a man on the verge of collapse, his steps heavy, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might crack his own teeth from the sheer force of it. His entire body radiating frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment he realized everything was slipping through his fingers. I had been expecting him, had been waiting for the inevitable explosion, had known from the second I cut him off financially that he wouldn't be able to keep his anger contained for long, and yet, watching him unravel in real time was somehow more pathetic than I had anticipated. He looked at me like I was the reason his life was falling apart, like I was the villain in his carefully constructed story, like I had stolen something that had never belonged to him in the first place. But all I could feel was a cold, detached satisfaction that sent a slow, deliberate pulse of victory through my veins. You really think this is funny, don't you? Mark snapped, his voice rough, unsteady, dangerously close to cracking under the weight of his own rage, his fingers twitching at his sides like he was barely restraining himself from slamming a fist into the nearest wall. You think this is some kind of game? You think you can just take everything and leave us with nothing? I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the kitchen counter, my arms crossed, my expression unreadable, refusing to rise to the bait he was so desperately dangling in front of me. I didn't take anything, I said, my voice calm, even, steady in a way that only made his anger burn hotter. I just stopped letting you take things that didn't belong to you. Mark let out a sharp, humorless laugh, running both hands through his hair before gripping the back of his neck, his frustration pouring out of him like a slow-building storm that had finally reached the point of no return. You don't even need the house, he spat, his eyes dark with resentment, his breathing uneven, his desperation seeping into every syllable. You don't even want it. You're just doing this to screw with us, and you know it. I tilted my head slightly, studying him the way someone might study an animal caught in a trap, watching as he squirmed under the weight of consequences he had never believed would come for him. That's where you're wrong, I said, my voice quiet but sharp, like a blade pressed just against the surface of his skin, not enough to draw blood, but enough to let him know it was there. I do want it. Not because I need it, not because I plan on living here, but because watching you and Mom scramble to find your footing after years of standing on a foundation you built out of lies is more satisfying than I ever could have imagined. His face twisted into something furious, something unhinged, something that reeked of entitlement and disbelief, like the idea of being held accountable had never even crossed his mind until this exact moment. You're just like Dad, he sneered, his voice filled with the kind of venom that only comes from deep, festering resentment. Always thinking you're better than everyone else, always acting like you're the only one who ever worked for anything, always looking down on the rest of us. I felt something dark and bitter settle in my chest, something sharp that clawed its way up my throat before I could stop it, something I had spent years suppressing but no longer felt the need to contain. No, Mark, I said, my voice low, steady, unwavering. Dad worked for everything he had. I worked for everything I had. You took shortcuts. You lied, cheated, and stole your way through life because you assumed someone else would clean up the mess you left behind. And Mom, I let out a slow breath, shaking my head slightly as I reached into the folder sitting on the counter beside me, pulling out the neatly stacked documents I had spent the last few days organizing. Mom made sure you never had to face the consequences of your actions, even when it meant stealing from the one person who actually gave a damn about this family. I watched as his confidence wavered, as his anger flickered into something closer to fear, as his mind tried to process what I had just said. But before he could recover, before he could open his mouth to argue, I threw the stack of papers onto the kitchen table with enough force that they scattered slightly across the surface. "You want to talk about who's really at fault here?" I asked, my voice sharp, my patience non-existent. Mom took out loans in Dad's name. She forged his signature, used his credit, drained his savings, all while pretending everything was fine, all while letting you bleed him dry because she thought she could fix it before he ever found out. And guess what, Mark? He found out. Mark paled, his eyes darting toward the documents as if they might burst into flames under his gaze, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his confidence unraveling faster than he could stop it. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had before, his bravado slipping away like water through his fingers. I let out a soft, humorless laugh, shaking my head as I crossed my arms over my chest. "No, I'm not," I said simply, watching as the reality of the situation finally began to settle in. "And you know I'm not." The kitchen fell into silence, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air, thick with the kind of tension that threatened to suffocate everything in its path. I could see the gears turning in his head, the way he was scrambling to come up with a way out, a way to shift the blame, a way to twist the narrative into something that didn't end with him and Mom losing everything. But for once, there was no escape route. No safety net, no convenient scapegoat to take the fall. I let the silence stretch between us, let him sit in the consequences of his own actions for just a little longer before finally pushing off the counter, reaching for the last piece of paper in the folder. My final move already in motion before he even had the chance to react. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice calm, collected, unwavering. "I don't need the house, which is why I'm selling it." The color drained from his face entirely, his mouth opening and closing uselessly, his breathing shallow as he processed what I had just said, as he realized there was no way to talk me out of it, no way to undo what had already been set in motion. And as I turned to leave, as I stepped past him and headed toward the front door, I could hear my mother's footsteps rushing toward me, could feel the desperation radiating off her in waves, could already anticipate the pathetic plea that was about to leave her lips. But it was too late. Because I wasn't finished yet. The house had been stripped of everything that made it feel like home, the walls bare, the furniture either sold or packed away, the echoes of a life once lived now replaced with the sterile emptiness of a space that no longer belonged to them. The sale had gone through faster than they expected, faster than they were prepared for, leaving Margaret and Mark scrambling, their carefully laid plans reduced to nothing more than dust and regret, their desperation growing with every passing day. I had been expecting the phone calls, the sudden attempts at reconciliation, the thinly veiled manipulations disguised as concern, and yet, when my mother finally called me for the last time, her voice brittle with something that wasn't quite surrender, but wasn't far from it, I still found myself pausing before answering. "Emma," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, a carefully measured tone that told me she was still trying to find an angle, still searching for some way to regain control of a situation that had long since slipped through her fingers. "We need to talk." I let the silence stretch between us, let her sit in the weight of everything she had done, let her feel the consequences of every decision she had made without considering what it would mean for the people around her. "There's nothing left to talk about," I finally said, my voice even, my patience non-existent, my heart hardened against the last remnants of guilt that still tried to cling to me like a dying flame refusing to be snuffed out. Her breath hitched slightly, the first real crack in her carefully constructed facade, and for a brief moment, I wondered if she was finally going to drop the act, finally going to admit that she had been wrong, finally going to say something real. But of course, she didn't. She never did. "You don't have to do this," she tried, her voice trembling just enough to make it sound like she meant it. "We're family, Emma. Families go through rough patches, but they don't just abandon each other. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head, a bitter amusement settling in my chest as I realized just how far she was willing to stretch reality to suit her own needs. "You abandoned me a long time ago," I said, my tone devoid of emotion, my grip tightening around the phone as I forced myself to say the words I had spent years burying. "You just never thought it would come back to you." She didn't respond right away, the silence on the other end of the line stretching so long that I almost thought she had hung up, but then I heard the sharp inhale, the barely contained frustration. The resentment simmering just beneath the surface of her forced composure. "What are we supposed to do now?" she asked finally, her voice laced with something close to panic, as if she had just now realized that there was no backup plan, no easy way out, no convenient scapegoat to fix the mess she had made. "That's not my problem," I said simply, shifting the weight of the leather briefcase in my hand, the one my father had always carried with him, the one he had locked away in his office for years, the one I had found buried beneath old tax documents and forgotten memories. "But I do have something for you." An hour later, I arrived at what was left of their life, the small rental house they had been forced into after losing everything. The once proud woman who had spent her life controlling everyone around her now reduced to someone who couldn't even meet my gaze without flinching. Mark was standing behind her, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his resentment so thick it was practically radiating off of him, his body tense as if he was barely holding himself together. I wondered how long it would take for them to turn on each other, how long before the reality of their situation became too much to ignore, how long before the blame they had been so eager to place on me shifted between them instead. I didn't bother stepping inside, didn't linger, didn't give them the satisfaction of thinking I had come to negotiate or plead or argue. Instead, I handed my mother the briefcase, watching as she hesitated before taking it, her fingers curling around the worn leather as if she already knew whatever was inside would only make things worse. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cautious, wary, unsure for the first time in her life. I met her gaze without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt, without the smallest trace of regret. "It's a bill," I said simply, watching as her brows furrowed, as her hands trembled slightly, as she fumbled with the latches before finally snapping them open, revealing the neatly organized stack of documents inside. "Every dollar you stole, every loan you took, every debt you left behind. All of it." Her breath hitched as she flipped through the papers, her eyes scanning the numbers, the statements, the undeniable proof of everything she had spent years pretending wasn't real. I saw the moment it truly hit her, the way the color drained from her face, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something but couldn't find the words. She looked up at me then, her expression a perfect mixture of disbelief and something dangerously close to fear. "You can't be serious," she whispered, but there was no confidence in her voice anymore, no sharpness, no fight left in her. I tilted my head slightly, offering her the smallest, coldest smile I could muster. "Oh, I'm completely serious," I said, stepping back, my gaze never leaving hers as I turned toward the door. "I expect full payment within the next 6 months. If I don't get it, I'll take legal action." Mark let out a choked sound of disbelief, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, his breathing uneven as he processed what was happening, as he realized that no amount of begging or threats or manipulation would change the outcome of this moment. "You're a real piece of work, you know that?" he spat, his voice dripping with hatred, his body practically vibrating with anger. I turned to him then, meeting his glare with an expression so devoid of emotion that it only seemed to enrage him further. "No, Mark," I said, my voice steady, unshaken, final. "I just learned from the best." And with that, I walked away, my steps unhurried, my shoulders light, my heart finally free from the weight of the past. I had won. I had taken everything they thought they could steal from me. I had left them with nothing but the consequences of their own greed. But as I stepped outside into the crisp evening air, I felt something shift deep inside me, something unsettled, something I couldn't quite name. I exhaled slowly, watching as my breath curled into the night sky, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost of something long forgotten. Was it worth it? I hesitated, just for a second, before whispering the only answer I had. Maybe, but at what cost?